Good evening, everybody. A really warm welcome to all of you, and thank you very much for joining us at the Economic Research Council, and a very warm welcome to today's session. Tonight, we're really honoured to be joined by Dr. Victoria Bateman, and her pioneering work offers us a fresh perspective on the role of women in the economic development of the West, as well as what can be taken from that for today's economies. Now, Victoria will speak for about 30 minutes, and then that'll be followed by a roughly 30-minute Q&A session. And we really do encourage you to engage actively. So please do submit any questions that you have via the Q&A section that's at the bottom of your screen. And before we go on to the actual talk, I'd just like to highlight the next event in our calendar. We'll be joined by Stephen Millard, who's the Deputy Director of the National Institute for Economic and Social Research at 7 p.m. on the 12th of March. And he'll delve into issues surrounding the modelling of unemployment, assessing various conceptualizations of unemployment and discussing the UK's recent labour market experience. And tickets for this are available now via our website. So please do visit there to book your place for free and to learn more about our upcoming events. Now, it's a real privilege to introduce Dr. Victoria Bateman, and I certainly have been looking forward to this one since we began preparations for it. If you're unaware of who she is, Victoria is an esteemed economic historian, and she spent a number of years as an economics fellow at the University of Cambridge. She's renowned for her bold insights into economic history and for her advocacy for gender equality. Now, her book, The Sex Factor, How Women Made the West Rich, draws on some of her research and explains how the freedom of women is central to our economic prosperity. So it's with great anticipation that I welcome Victoria to share her insights. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, David, for such a kind introduction. And thank you to the Economic Research Council for inviting me along. It really is a pleasure to be speaking with everyone this evening. I want to begin with a question. Why are some countries rich and so many others still poor? Once you start to think about that question, it is difficult to think about anything else. After all, the stakes are high. If we can find the right answer, then we have the power to unlock millions of people from poverty across the world today. And so it's the question that first brought me to the study of economics. And the way that I've chosen to approach it is through the perspective of economic history. And in particular, to think, how did Britain, a tiny little island on the edge of Europe, manage to go from poverty to prosperity across the course of economic history? Now, that's actually an incredibly difficult question to answer, given that for millennia, across human history, all of the interesting economic action was taking place well eastwards of Europe. I think too many of us today have this assumption that the West has always been best. But actually, for the majority of human history, the West was a backwater to the global economy. And in fact, a lot of interesting economic action was instead taking place in three primary areas that have been studied by historians. So in China, particularly in the Yellow River Valley, in India and Pakistan, in the Indus River Valley, and also in the Near East. And so that by that, I mean Turkey, modern day Turkey, and down to southern Iraq, to the ancient region of Mesopotamia, which falls between the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers, sometimes referred to as the Fertile Crescent, the center of the beginnings of human civilization. So it's in those three areas of the world, in China, in India, Pakistan, and in Mesopotamia, where we see the first economic revolutions in human history. So the very first time that human beings settled down in one place and farmed the land, rather than living nomadically, chasing animals whilst wearing animal skins and perhaps barefooted. These are also the three places where we see the first towns and cities. So places like Jericho in the Holy Land, Catalhoyuk in modern day Turkey. And these are also the three places where we see the written word, the development of written language, and with it, some of the first scholarly and scientific activities in human history. So for most of human history, all of the interesting action was taking place well beyond Europe. Europe was a backwater, and Britain was a backwater to the backwater. And, even if I take you to the last 2 millennia, so if we come out of ancient times and into more recent history, and let's go beyond the peak of the Romans and the Greeks, let's put them to bed and let's move on from that. Where was the world, after the fall of Rome? Well, probably the first part of the world to experience an economic golden age after the end of Rome was the Middle East. And so, in the centuries after Muhammad, we see the development of the Islamic Caliphate, the Abbasid Empire. And so by around 800, 900 AD, something of that sort, the Islamic world stretched from Spain right across northern Africa, through modern-day Iraq, Iran, and all the way out to the edge of India, up through Central Asia to neighbor China, to neighbor what was then the Tang dynasty of China. And so this Islamic world was the center of global economic activity. And at that time, Baghdad was 30 times the size of London. And historians describe the Mediterranean at that time as being a Muslim lake. This was Muslim commerciality that was driving global economic activity. It was Arabian merchants that were going out to India and China and globalizing the world at that time. And then after that Islamic golden age in the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, then China takes over. Then China goes through its own golden age from the 10th century through to really the early 13th century, which is when we see the rise of the Mongols and, the Mongol Empire that eventually reaches out from China, conquers Baghdad, puts an end to that Muslim Abbasid Caliphate. And so China really, takes over up to the 13th century. And Europe was, historians like to portray Europe as being in the Dark Ages, throughout these centuries. Certainly if you look at, say, the year 1086, the guesstimates of GDP that we have, of global GDP that we have, and they are guesstimates more than estimates, but the size of economic activity put Britain at that time 60% poorer than China. And this is on per capita basis. So the average person in Britain in 1086, 60% poorer than the average person in China. So, Britain was a backwater to a backwater that was Europe. Now, in the Middle Ages, so by about the 14th century, something is starting to change in Europe. Europe is very much emerging from the Dark Ages and actually is undergoing a commercial boom. And through the last few hundred years there, Europe has pulled itself out of feudalism, out of a system of really a semi-slave-based system in which the masses of people are tied to the land that is in turn owned by the knights of the realm, who of course build their castles to protect their property. Europe is starting to emerge out of that feudalism, out of that system of serfdom, to become a much more commercial economy, with privately owned land, with people who have ownership over themselves, over their own labor, who are now trading with one another. But the first part of Europe to really emerge in that way wasn't Britain, it was Italy. And so we think of Venice, for example, we think of the glory of Venice. Now, you might say that's not too surprising given the Roman heritage. So there we have Italy, and then next Spain. So by the 1400s, 1500s, it is Spain that is starting to overtake Italy, is going out across the world, building the first European colonial empire. And then it's the Dutch by the 1600s. Holland is going through a golden age, is similarly copying Spain, going out into the world, building global connections and building its own empire. And then it's only in much more recent times that Britain starts to overtake not only these, world regions that had been there ahead of Europe for millennia, but these other European countries as well. So let's ask, how did Western Europe manage not only to catch up, but overtake parts of the world that had been ahead for millennia? And within that, how was it that particularly a country like Britain was able to move from backwater status to eventually becoming in the 1800s the richest economy in the world? Now, economic historians have been trying to answer this question for a very long time. And so there are a lot of answers out there. And let me show you a couple of examples. Joel Mockyer's book, The Enlightened Economy, who puts it all down to the Enlightenment. Who else do I have? The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith puts it all down to markets. Karl Marx, Das Kapital, and his various other writings that put it all down, not to the liberation that markets have to offer, but the exploitation that comes with the birth of capital that leads to the exploitation of the working classes. And then if you globalize that, then the exploitation of peoples across the world and wealth built on the back of that exploitation. So we have those answers that have been provided. And then we have yet another one. I'll give you a fourth example, Robert C. Allen. The British Industrial Revolution in Global Perspective, published in 2009, argues actually contrary to Karl Marx, that it wasn't exploitation that led Britain to become the richest economy in the world. It was a high wage economy that actually, it wasn't, the Industrial Revolution didn't take place in a part of the world where labor was cheap, where workers were cheap and abundant. It took place in a part of the world, Britain, where actually compared with the rest of the world, workers, labor was actually quite expensive. And he argues that it was actually that expensive labor, a high wage economy, that drove the mechanization of the economy. That if you can rely on exploiting people, why do you develop machines? Why do you develop technologies? Because it's cheap enough just to have loads of people to do the production activities that your business needs. It's only when you have expensive labor that actually you start to develop a more mechanized, a more technologically based economy of a kind that can create sustained long-run growth that allows your economy not just to have a golden age of a couple of centuries or so, but to keep on growing. So those are the various answers that have been provided by economic historians so far. Now, those answers tend to revolve around men, around merchants, around industrialists, around inventors and scientists. We can think about, Brunel, we can think about Watt, we can think about Arkwright, we can even think about people like Rockefeller, Ford of the motor factory fame. When we think about the merchants, the traders, the inventors, the industrialists, it's typically male names that come to the fore. And I think there is often a common assumption that if you get the economy right, if you get the economy going, if you can generate economic growth, get that right first, and then afterwards, it is social freedoms that will follow. So women just have to wait for the economy to get going on the back of, the male merchants and industrialists and so on. And then through the suffragette movement, we can all become free and we can vote and we can get involved in the economy and everything's fine. And more generally, too, with other social freedoms. Now, what I do in my book, The Sex Factor, is to turn the tables on that and say, actually, women's rights shouldn't come second, they should come first. That if you look at what was different in Western Europe compared with China, India, Pakistan, the Middle East, that had been at the top of the economic league table for millennia, if you look at what was different about Western Europe, it wasn't what was going on in men's lives, it was actually what was going on in women's lives. And it is, I think, that secret ingredient, that was what allowed Western Europe and a country like Britain not just to catch up with, but to overtake these other world regions. So let me talk about, women in the Western world on the eve of the rise of the West. Now, I want to say, first of all, what I'm talking about here are not elite women. I want to talk about everyday women. What's key is what's going on in the lives of, the majority of women in our society, everyday women. And what I think is particularly noticeable is that if you look at, say, Britain, going back to medieval times, going back to the 1300s, 1400s, 1500s, the average woman worked. And so, for example, in London, if you look at the records from the 1300s, 1400s, we see that women were not only, makers of cloth, they were brewers of beer. They were merchants. They were selling food out on the streets of London. In agriculture, they were working as dairymaids. And in fact, one of the things that happened after the Black Death, so in the middle of the 1300s, where you get this big demographic shock, where around a third of the population died as a result of the plague, is there were big labor shortages. You see more and more women being drawn into the labor force. And for those who survived the Black Death, you were in the money, because with labor shortages, this is now a higher wage economy. You could earn more. And that boosts the consumption of things that women in the economy are making or producing. And so one of the things that happens after the Black Death is people's diet shifts more to meat and dairy. So we stop, for example, eating so much bread, which is cheap and fills you up, and we shift to more luxury food items like meat, like dairy. And that proved actually to be very good for the employment of women in the agricultural sector, because women were the dairymaids. And so the more cattle that you have, the more beef eating, the more eating of milk and cheese and other things, the more that was creating jobs for women. Another thing that happens with these, this higher wage economy after the Black Death is people pretty much double their consumption of beer and ale. And women tended to be the brewers in society. So again, you've got lots of extra demand for the types of things that women are producing. Another thing that women tended to be producing in Britain at that time was silk. So women were the producers of silk cloth. Again, and that's something that people with higher wages can start to buy a bit more of, those more luxurious fabrics for fancier outfits and so on. So we see actually when we look at the types of, women's involvement in economic activity, going back as far as the Middle Ages in Britain, it really is quite noticeable how many women were there. Now, of course, in other world regions, women had to work. Women have always had to work. We've never been wealthy enough as a society that we can afford for a big chunk of the population to sit around, taking leisure. But typically, women were expected to stay within their own homes, to work within their own homes, to be at the spinning wheel within their own homes, under the command of their parents or parents-in-law. And so without the financial independence that not just working, but working outside of the home can offer. Now, that brings me to another feature of women in Western Europe, and particularly a country like Britain, and again, from really the Middle Ages onwards, and that is an unusually high age of marriage for women. So whereas in China, in the Middle East, in India and Pakistan at the time, it was quite common for girls to be married by the age of 18, the average age of marriage of a woman in Britain in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s was 25 or 26, which is a remarkably modern age, actually. So the average woman would go out to work. She might take up a job as a dairymaid on a service contract of, say, 10 years. And then she would wait until she found someone of her own choosing to marry. And during the time that she is waiting to find the love of her life, she works and she saves with a view that if she does get married, she wants to set up her own household rather than being absorbed into a wider family, rather than living with her parents-in-law. So what you have is a situation in which Western women are out there active in the economy and they are waiting to get married. They're not getting married until their mid-20s. And this results in quite an unusual family structure and family system of small nuclear households in which you have, because women are getting married later in life, they're having fewer children. And this, I argue, in the sex factor, this remarkably modern family structure that really comes out of the fact that women are out there engaging in the economy and so have this financial independence, and with it, this ability to take charge of their lives, to take charge of the marriage decision, to decide whether, when, and who to marry later in life, have these smaller families, that has a number of really significant positive effects on the economy that help to sow the seeds of economic growth. And the first one is that because of these smaller families, it helps to prevent excessive population growth from undermining the high wages that you have after that Black Death period. So, the Black Death, as I said, that hits in the middle of the 1300s, and that travels right across Europe, actually from the Far East. And so you have this destruction of populations right across Eurasia. But what happens over time is those populations then tend to rebuild. And for example, by the time you get to Qing China in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, population is booming. There's a big overpopulation problem. With that, you see environmental degradation, chopping down of trees. With that, soil silting up rivers, flooding, and so on. Whereas what you see in Western Europe is these smaller families that help to put a lid on population growth, and with that, create the conditions for this continued high wage economy. And it's that high wage economy that in turn is creating this incentive for mechanization in the economy, an incentive for businesses to look to machinery, to look to technology, to supplement this very costly labor that they have in order to produce. So, going back to Robert C. Allen's high wage theory of the Industrial Revolution, what I argue is at the root of that is actually women's freedom, that it is women's freedom that gives Western Europe that high wage economy. Now, there are other advantages as well to these smaller families, that are earning these higher wages with these fewer numbers of children, and that is that families can better afford to educate their children. So with fewer mouths to feed and fewer children to educate, you're better able to afford to apprentice your children. So that helps to build up the skill base in the economy. So we've got incentives for mechanization. We've got the ability to afford to educate, to skill up people in your society. Third thing, savings and investment, again, with these smaller families that come on the back of women's economic participation in the economy. Families are better able to afford to save, and those savings can, of course, be channeled through to investment in the economy, providing the funds for the machines and the technologies that are moving the economy forward. Now, there's something else as well. I mean, as economists, we're used to debating, is it the markets or the state that's pushes economies forward? Do we need more state? Do we need more markets? And actually, I argue in the Sex Factor that that women's freedom and the way that affects family life actually makes both state and markets better. So where you have the much more traditional extended family units, where girls are married off young, are absorbed into multi-generational households, in a sense, that multi-generational family is its own economy. It can do everything that it needs to look after itself. So in China, for example, you have situations in which brothers with their wives and their children are living together with parents. And so you can divide up tasks between you. You can look after everything you need to provide for survival. If you have a situation with these smaller, more nuclear families, then you have to cooperate with people beyond your own little family unit. You can't get by without it. And so what happens is you're able to build up the cooperation and the generalized trust, the social capital that helps markets develop to a higher level, and also helps to push you towards a state that is much more based on cooperation and much less based on exploitation. And let me build on that, because, when we think about democracy, now, actually, the roots of democracy are very often within the home, because if you have a patriarchal family system in which young people, not just young women, but boys, are brought up to shut up and to be under the rule of thumb of the patriarch, then you're not encouraged to question. You're not socialized to answer back, to question. And so you can't possibly do that when it comes to politics. Whereas in a less patriarchal family system of a kind that develops in Western Europe, young people, they're going to leave home, set up their own independent households. They can't depend on the patriarch. And so, they grow up questioning, answering back, developing those skills that are required to make sure that once democracy is established, that it stays intact. So really, the success or not of democracy rises or falls on, what's going on in the home, whether in the home we're taught to speak up or to shut up. So in those ways, I argue in the Sex Factor, it is women's freedom and the way that affects family life that really sowed the seeds of economic growth in the long term, sowed the seeds of the Industrial Revolution. Now, what about today? So across the world today, we see how sadly so many societies still restrict women's economic involvement, despite the fact that it is bad for the economy. Why do they do that? Well, that brings me on to my more recent book, Naked Feminism, Breaking the Cult of Female Modesty, published just last year, where I look at what it is in the culture of societies that leads women to be secluded within their own homes, to be kept out of the wider economic sphere. And I argue it is the cult of female modesty. It is the way in which, as a society, we tend to place a woman's value on her bodily modesty, on the degree to which a woman's body has been seen or touched. It's the way that we divide women up into the good girls and the harlots, with a line between the two. And when women cross that line, they are shunned, they are punished, they are the subjects of abuse. So where you have societies where a woman's worth, a woman's respect, a woman's value depends on her bodily purity, it is all important to protect those women, to protect the purity, to protect those women from outside pollution. And that means, for example, families that want to protect their daughters, that don't want to see them going off to university where they might be spoilt by interacting with men, that don't want to see their wives going off into the labour market where there's a risk that they, again, could be mixing with men and could be polluted by other men. So this cult of female modesty affects the access of girls to education, it affects the access of women to work, it affects women's health as well. And so when you look at, for example, what denies women access to contraception and abortion, it is very often a fear of promiscuity, a fear that if women and girls have access to contraception and abortion, that they'll become promiscuous harlots, and that will ruin them, that will be bad for them and bad for the rest of society. The abuse women face, from their husbands on the street, often in response to the way they've dressed or the way that they've behaved in front of other men. So many, I think, of the problems that women face across the world, whether it is compulsory hijab in Iran, whether it is in Afghanistan today, the withdrawal of women and girls from education and from work, in Israel, where we've seen increasing segregation of women from men over the last couple of decades, in America, where we've seen abortion ban, where we've seen a rise of purity culture with purity balls and purity pledges for teenage girls and so on. So many of these things, the problems that women face today, are a result of this cult of female modesty. And so ultimately, I think if we want to place our economies on a better path, we need to think more about those connections between society and culture and the economy, the deep roots of what's going on in society and culture. And what I call for in my last book, Breaking the Cult of Female Modesty, ultimately the freedom of all women is rooted in the freedom that they have over themselves, over their own body. I will end there.
Oh, excellent. Thank you very, very much for that, Victoria. It was extremely fascinating and well worth the wait for me. I really, really appreciate you taking the time to lay that all out, and I'm sure the audience do as well. So we'll move on to the Q&A session now. If you do have any questions, please do pop them in and I will receive them and relay them to Victoria. We've got a couple that have come in already, but if you don't mind, I'm going to answer my own one first.
Yeah.
Jumping the queue. So essentially, do you think that notion that we experienced just before the Industrial Revolution, do you think that can be kind of taken up as a model in modern day society? And I guess from there, do you feel like there are any kind of arguments for kind of cultural relativism, if you like, especially with those less developed economies?
Yeah. I mean, certainly, if you look across the world today, if we look at women's labour force participation compared with men, so 1 in 2 women across the world today is engaged in paid work, compared with about 80% of men.
Yeah.
Women on average are paid 20% less than men and take care of about, they do 3 times the amount of care work that men are responsible for in the economy. If we value all of the unpaid care work that women are doing across the world, then that would be the equivalent of about 40% of global GDP. There's a lot of work that women are doing behind the scenes that economists are not measuring and not accounting for. and yet is providing, vital support for our wider economy. If we look at the ownership of, resources in the economy, if we look at the ownership of land, women own less than 20% of the land across the world today. If we look at the number of billionaires, the richest people in the world, only 12% of those are women, and actually more than half of female billionaires are billionaires because they have they're heiresses. They've inherited it from a man. So we have these serious unequal distributions, across the world today. And I do honestly believe that, key to resolving these is ensuring that women have equal access to the economy compared with men. I'm not asking for anything more than for women to be equal to men. Now, I think, sometimes people suggest that, the market, for example, is a terrible thing, and the market involves naked greed, and that the last thing we need to do is encourage, women's market activity. But what I would actually say against that is the family can also be terrible. So many of the injuries inflicted on women revolve around what's happening in the home. The exploitation of women within the home. If we look at, female genital mutilation, if we look at virginity testing, if we look at, foot binding in ancient China, if we look at domestic violence, so many of the problems that women face are rooted in the home. The home isn't some, magical haven where women are safe from the rest of the world, where we can keep them safe from pollution, from, if they go out there into the rest of the world. And, very often, actually, it is the ability to get out of the home, to get out there, to engage in paid work that the market can offer, that allows women to stand up to those problems that are rooted in the home. Now, there is, though, an asymmetry here, because, whilst women can, in a sense, turn their backs on their families, can walk away. If they're in a family that's trying to arrange a marriage for them, to marry them off, they can run off, get a job elsewhere, set up, their own independent life. It's not going to be easy, but at least if you have that option, you can do that. It works asymmetrically in the sense that a woman can go out and do that, but her family might be left ashamed. And so where you have an honor culture in which a man's honor depends on the behavior of female relatives, how they behave, how they dress, then that can create a problem for families whose female relatives are going off into the world, building an independent life for themselves. So if you look at, for example, Egypt, Morocco, Palestine, 8 out of 10 men believe that their honor depends on how their female relatives dress and behave. And more than a third believe that the victims of honor killings deserve to be killed. So we do have a big problem rooted in the family, and it's all very well, I think, with cultural relativism saying, oh, well, we can have these nice, big intergenerational families where, women can be kept safe from the world or whatever else. The reality on the ground is, I think, very different. And it is, opportunities for women to move beyond the family into the market that I think is absolutely crucial to not just to women's freedom, women building their lives, but as I argue in the sex factors, to sowing those seeds of economic growth. Now, of course, in my ideal world, my ideal utopia would be that the family and the market, in a sense, act as a check on each other, because we do know, sadly, that if you're out there in the market without a family to fall back on, without relatives to fall back on, then that's when you're more likely to be exploited in the market. Because you can't, if you're being mistreated at work, say, enough is enough. I'm going to go home and wait and find another job. But similarly, it's difficult for your family to exploit you if you can walk off and get a job. So in a sense, the family and the market, society and the market can act as a check on each other. And so very often the most successful people in our societies are those that have both that ability to get out there in the market and have that, that family that they can rely on as well. So at the same time, I wouldn't say I'm anti-family, but I think things can go horribly wrong when women are locked into, secluded into a life within the family.
Great. Very compelling answer. Yeah. Thank you very much. Okay, we've got some questions here from the audience then. First one is it possible to have a relatively high wage economy and still have labour being exploited? For example, with skilled, well-paid labour being sustained by cheap food supplied by cheap agricultural labour?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I am afraid to say that, when you look at the gender gap historically in Britain, and I talked about this high wage economy from the Black Death onwards, the gender pay gap is still very visibly there. It was very common for men to be paid twice as much as women, for example, for doing the same job, basically. And whilst women were, yes, very active in the economy, they tended to be much more present in the less skilled parts of the economy, perhaps more in the casual part of the labour force than the more formal part of the labour force. So absolutely, there were gender disparities in the labour market, and it would have been even better if there had been no gender pay gap. And if, for example, the guilds that controlled access to the skilled professions hadn't been increasingly locking women out of, being engaged in those skilled professions. And I'm afraid to say the trade unions too. So, during the Industrial Revolution itself, as you see the beginnings of a trade union movement, it's very sad that actually you see a number of the trade unions pushing to restrict the employment of women. And they did this supposedly with good intentions, with a view that it was better for families if women were in the home. And they used it as an argument to push for higher wages for men to support their wives and their children. That if we can eliminate the competition that is women in the labour market, we can push up the wages of men even further. And that allows the men to support a wife at home who's engaging in unpaid labour within the home. And, even Karl Marx, in his book Das Kapital, moans about the way in which women's employment is leading them to neglect their work in the home, and how good it is, for example, that in periods of economic downturn, women have the chance to learn to cook and sew. There was a very strong belief in the 19th century that healthier families required women to be in the home, that if women were out working, that it leads to the neglect of children, unclean homes, and that was bad for people's health and well-being. So the unpaid labour that women were providing in the home was seen really as key to health and well-being, and then through that to society, to making a contribution to society more generally. And so it's in the 19th century really that the housewife is born. Up to then, women are out engaging in the labour market, and yes, very often they are doing the lesser paid work. And then it's in the 19th century, really, that we start to see the development, the idea of the housewife, firstly amongst the middle classes and then spreading through to the working classes. And then what you see really with the suffragette movement is trying to get things back to where they were. The 20th century has been really about, returning back to where things were, not just treading new ground.
Thank you. Thank you. We've got another question here from Economics in 10, which is an excellent podcast, one of my favorite actually, and I would encourage everyone to have a listen to it. When the livery and guild companies were set up, was there any female involvement in these, or was it a way of males taking leadership of those industries?
Oh, such a good question. And in fact, let me talk about the Brewers Guild in London. So the Brewers Guild really gets going in the 1400s, in part because you've got this boom in brewing activity after the Black Death. More people are able to afford to buy, beer and ale, and so you've got more people producing, and then you see the development of this guild of brewers coming together to set their own standards, to determine training requirements, so to set up, apprenticeship requirements and so on. And now in that, in the early days of the Brewers Guild, a third of the members were women. So you do see some examples where you have quite a lot of female involvement in the early days, but then it is true that over time, some of these guilds do try and lock women out. So, for example, bring in requirements that if you're going to join the guild, you have to be a man. There were exceptions, though. Exceptions tended to be for wives and daughters. So even the guilds that closed themselves to female entry would allow the wives and daughters of male guild members to practice the trade and to engage, to become a member of the guild. And it was certainly common in Britain, for example, that when a man who was a member of a skilled trade passed away, that the business would pass to his wife. And in his will, he would leave even the equipment of the business to his wife with a view that she would carry on. She would carry on the trade.
Okay, thank you. I'll take these two questions at the same time because I think they'll probably be maybe a little bit quicker for you to answer potentially. What could or should the Prime Minister do for women in the UK? And which British woman figure has been the most revolutionary in your opinion?
Yeah. So crisis of care. I mean, that's the big problem that needs solving. If we look, I mean, in the sex spectre, I set out my manifesto for the future of economics, and I ask, please beg of economists if we can have 4 things. And the first thing is to recenter economics on content rather than approach. So to have a more holistic view of what economics is, to not be guided by, say, what we can study through maths, to think about economics much more broadly. And that includes, breaking down the barriers between what we see as the economy and what we see as society, so life in the home, for example, that for a long time has been neglected when it comes to the study of economics, that we need to break down the barrier between what we see as the economy and, the rest of society. Greater interdisciplinarity. So that's something that I'm always calling for. As economists, we need to be magpies. We need to study history. We need to study a bit of sociology. We need to study philosophy. There are so many things that we need to know about if we're going to have this more holistic view of the economy. Third thing, we need to spend more time listening and less time talking. I'm not being very good at that this evening, but we need to listen to people, out there in the economy, rather than staying stuck in our ivory towers and just talking between ourselves, between economists and policymakers. We need to listen out there. I mean, actually, just on social media earlier today, the Working Class Economists group, Neil Glynn, posted a fabulous comment saying, why as economists are we measuring GDP and not alongside placing statistics on, how many people are going hungry in this country, how many people are homeless in this country? And so when it comes to budget statements and so on in the House of Commons, we shouldn't just be told what's happening to economic growth. We should be tracking, what is happening to the number of people who are homeless, the number of people who have gone without a meal in the last quarter, for example. Speak to real people, think about what is happening on the ground. And then fourthly, we need to dispel the macho biases within the discipline. So often I have heard economists refer to things as soft, history, sociology. These are the soft things. These are not the things that we should be, that we should be spending our time on. These are the kind of easy, soft things. And those are also the things typically seen as feminine. It's maths, it's rigor, technical rigor that is seen as masculine. And so no wonder as a subject that we've pushed away these other areas that really have a bearing on us as economists. So I think only if we dispel these macho biases can we, look more holistically at what we study as economists, how we study it, the assumptions we make along the way, what we measure and how we measure it. And I think, if we could do all of those things taken together, then the crisis of care that our country faces at the moment would be top and center of any agenda when it comes to thinking about the economy. And this is a problem. It is getting worse with time, and it is going unresolved. And it is not just women, but a large proportion of that burden is borne by women. As I say, globally across the world, women do 3 times as much unpaid care as men. It is the equivalent to 2 billion people working full time for nothing across the world, the amount of unpaid care. So this isn't just a problem in Britain, it is a problem across the world. So that's something that seriously needs looking at, and more generally, as I say, breaking down those barriers between what we see as the proper economy and what we see as, the non-economy, the society, family life, and so on, and thinking more about the connections between the two. I think the crisis of care is just a perfect example of where we've gone wrong by failing to do that.
Okay. Thank you. And another question here. Do you feel that interesting question, do you feel that the role of the male breadwinner, which was promoted in Britain during the industrialization, eroded the partnership of the married couple under acts such as the New Poor Law?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, for most of history, the production unit has been the household. And what you had was men and women working together in the home. It might be, say, the wife might be spinning, the husband might be weaving, as was, very often the case in British history. The wife might be looking after the chickens and milking the cows, whilst the husband is ploughing in the fields, and so on. And so you have this production unit. The home is not just a unit of consumption, a place of consumption, a place where we consume stuff. It is also the place where we produce stuff, and men and women kind of working together jointly, cooperatively, in order to achieve that. And in medieval times, businesses tended to be family businesses with brewing companies. You might have the wife doing the brewing and the husband going out and sourcing the grain for the production of that beer or ale. And so you have that joint effort. And certainly where you see the rise of this male breadwinner model in Victorian England, you see much more this kind of separate spheres, that it is, as I say, women are expected to look after health and well-being, to keep the home clean, to look after the children, to provide a stress-free environment in which the husband can come home and shed his woes and see you cradling the newborn baby, and that altruism then balances out the selfish naked greed of the market, and keeps the husband on an even keel. That really becomes the ideal in the Victorian age.
Thank you. And another question here. Do you think there is an argument to say that if male and female wages were the same post-Black Death, then female participation would have been less likely. And they go on to say that it was only getting a cost saving by using women that increased participation. And this is the Milton Friedman argument that the discriminator should pay for his discrimination through higher costs, and therefore there should not be equal pay acts.
Yeah. Oh, so much there. We could spend the next hour. We could spend the next hour dealing with those things. I mean, it is something that Claudia Goldin, of course, one of the recent winners of the Nobel Prize. We're very proud, I think, as an economics profession, of the work that Claudia Goldin has done. And one of the things she talks about is this U-shaped labor force participation trend when it comes to women. So if you think across the course of economic development, that women's labor force participation can start off quite high and then it drops before it rises back up again. And certainly one of the arguments that is made is that as economies become richer, they can, in a sense, afford for the wife to stay at home, producing the kinds of goods that it might be difficult to buy on the market. So a comfortable, calm home, proper home-cooked meals, nourished children, and so on. So certainly that is an argument that's been made. And one of the things that we're seeing, for example, in India in recent years is that as India has advanced, has become richer, women's labor force participation has started to fall off. It's been declining. And I think that's the case in some other South Asian countries as well. So it is... it's certainly, that U-shaped trend. And actually, I think if you look across the whole of human history, it's that's been repeated throughout the whole of human history. But, there are lots of gendered assumptions in terms of when it comes to, well, we can afford for one of us to stay at home. Why does that always have to be the woman that's the one that has to stay at home? So I don't think that is something that we should accept as natural. I think really a situation in which, certainly I'm not against, women staying in the home. But I would like to be in a world where men have that option as well, where we see, parity in terms of, the proportion of unpaid work that happens in the home between men and that's carried out by men and women, and similarly the proportion of paid work that's carried out by men and women.
Okay, great, thank you. And I guess following on from that, if largely women's unpaid work was fully recognized and fully valued, what impacts do you see that? Well, firstly, how would you achieve that? Firstly, but what impacts do you see that happening? Do you see that having, on economic policy, on labour markets, and so on?
Yeah. So as I say, across the world, it's been calculated that if we were to measure women's unpaid work in the home, it would boost GDP by 40%. Now, that is a pretty big increase. Now, I'm not going to say suddenly, therefore, our economies have grown, because they haven't, because that work was still, going on. It's not like that's come from nowhere. But I think it is about recognition. It is about understanding that if you are, as a government, going to really encourage women to get involved in the labour market, that they haven't been sat around doing nothing. They have been, for example, caring for children. And when they go into the labour market, those children need to still be cared for. And so you need to provide proper childcare, for example. Ensure that there is adequate provision of childcare. So you can't have your cake and eat it. And so I think really by measuring it, it forces us to see the work that is taking place, and then to be aware of trade-offs, and to realize that if we are to have an economy in which women are active, then we need the proper supports to be there.
Yeah, thank you. And as we've hit 8 o'clock, I think we'll start to leave things there. Just one final quick question, if you don't mind. Is there a female economist or maybe female economic actor that you've come across that has inspired you the most?
So I would say Mary Wollstonecraft.
Oh, great choice.
Yes, from the 18th century, a woman who lived through the French Revolution. In fact, not only did she live through it, she kind of went and joined it in Paris in the late 18th century. There was a statue unveiled in her honor in 2020 in a London square, and it became a real point of contention amongst feminists because this statue in her honor, an abstract kind of sculptural mess, emerging from the top of it was a little naked figure of a woman. And many feminists were up in arms about this. Some even went and covered up this naked woman on top of this statue. They said it was embarrassing, it was disappointing, that this isn't relevant to Mary Wollstonecraft's writing, that Wollstonecraft was trying to champion women's education and through that their involvement in the economy. Now, my response to that is actually what I really love about Mary Wollstonecraft is that she really understood the deep roots of what it is that limits women's education and their involvement in the economy. And that is this cult of female modesty. She talked about how the manuals of the time, the women's manuals of the time, were specious poisons that encourage women to focus more on their virginity and chastity than on their wider development. How that focus on women's reputation led parents, even wealthy parents, to want to keep their daughters at home, to not let them go out into the world, to adventure, to get educated, because of fear that they would be ruined, that they would be polluted by mixing with men. So I think Mary Wollstonecraft has, I think she was ahead of her time actually in what she was arguing. And, not only does she deserve to be called an economist for a lot of the work that she did, but also she really understood those connections between society and economy.
Apologies, I was on mute. Thank you very, very much, Victoria. And thank you so much for taking the time to deliver such an excellent and insightful presentation. I've certainly learned a hell of a lot today, and I'm sure our audience has taken a lot from it as well. Really appreciate you taking the time this evening.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. And a big thank you to everybody else who's joined on this webinar as well. Just a quick reminder that our next event will be on the 12th of March, and you can find information about that online. But other than that, thank you very much for joining, and thank you very much, Victoria Bateman. Have a lovely
Thank you. Thank you.